Introducing the Gnome desktop. In this video, we're going to examine the Gnome desktop environment and introduce the Linux command terminal. At the end of the last video, we completed the Linux installation, and when you were done, you should have been facing something that looks a lot like this. The Linux desktop, the Gnome desktop specifically, sitting in our console window. Well, we've got a few things going on here. We can tweak a couple of things. For one, it's not very big. Linux installs the desktop at a resolution of 800 by 600 by default. And it's really not that big. So our first step is to give ourselves some more screen real estate. Now, Gnome works through a series of these drop-down menus along the top bar here. Right? So if we click under Applications, go to System Tools, we'll see a link here for Settings. Click on that. And then under the Settings menu, we have an icon for displays. And you can see right here the default 800 by 600 screen resolution. It's showing as an unknown display because this is coming through a virtual machine and it can't really identify what the actual monitor is. Not an issue, that's not going to be a problem for us. If you click this drop down, you can see all the other resolutions that are supported. Now, you want to be careful. If you make this thing too big, it's been known to cause the Linux VM to lock up. And when it locks up hard, and really the only thing you can do is reset it. Should that happen, it's not a big deal. You simply go back here to vDirector and do a hard reset of the system, and it'll come back to what it was when you first started. Let's go ahead and select 1152 by 864. Click Apply. That looks a little better. Drag this out here. Okay, good. That looks good. So we are going to go in and say keep this configuration. And there's our new desktop resolution. And we can close that out. Now we have some room to work. I encourage you to go through and explore the Gnome options. The options that are available will depend based on the installation option you chose at install time, but the format is always going to be the same. Right, so here's our web browser, the LibreOffice, Office Suite, and all that. Well, this week's chapter goes and introduces the command terminal. As nice as this is, as admins, we're going to spend most of our time in a command line environment. We have a couple of ways of accessing a command terminal. One way is to go through the Applications dropdown, Utilities, and scroll down and you see a link here for Terminal. And behold, the Linux CLI. Another method is to simply right-click on the desktop, and there's an option here to open in terminal. And that too will open up a CLI terminal. Notice I have two going. There's nothing wrong with having multiple terminals running at one time. In fact, you probably will. Very commonly, you'll have some process going in one window and you're working in another one. That's fine. They simply get different terminal IDs and they can run alongside each other, no problem. Let's take a closer look at what we have going on here. Let me minimize that guy. This first piece right here is called the command prompt. And it has very distinct meaning. And if you look at it, it begins with Bob. That's the user. I'm logged in as the user Bob. You can kind of see that in the upper right-hand corner here. So we have the username at localhost. Localhost is the host name of this Linux machine. We haven't assigned a host name yet, so the installer just gave it the default name of localhost. Not a problem. We'll worry about that in a future chapter. The little tilde here actually is shorthand for Bob's home directory. This command prompt will show you what directory you're in at any given time. Now we haven't covered directory structure yet. We don't talk about that until a future chapter. But notice if I change directory to the Etsy folder, now my prompt changes. See, it shows me as being in the Etsy folder. Let's go back to Bob's home directory. And then the last piece is a little $sign. That $sign means unprivileged user. Bob is just a regular user account. Compared to an administrative account like root, that will have a hashtag or a little £sign. Well, the chapter introduced a number of commands, a number of bash commands, and bash, the born again shell, is the shell that we're working on right here. It's the default shell for CentOS. And it really has hundreds of commands. I mean, it's full of scripting commands, and it's capable of actually some pretty advanced programming structures. Here's the thing, you don't need to know them all to get started. I had a music teacher once tell me that even though there are dozens and dozens of guitar chords, you can play 80% of music if you know like 15 or 20 of them, tops. Well, that's the same idea here. Even though there's hundreds of Linux commands, you can do 80% of what you'll normally be doing if you understand about 20, 25 of the commands and know how to find the other commands. And we'll talk about that here. The bash shell is an interpreted interactive shell, which means it executes commands as soon as I type them in. But one of the commands we're looking at is the ls command. And what this does is it lists the contents of whatever directory you're in. So notice I type ls, and I hit enter, and here are folders. I can tell they're folders because these words are blue. The shell is color-coded, and it just displays it to the screen, right? So it just shows me my folders that are there. Well, the reading describes the different parts of the commands. We have the command, which here in this case is ls. We have switches, which affects how the command functions. And we have arguments, which means what is the command going to act on. On most commands, if you give it no switch or no arguments, it'll execute on whatever it is you're in at the current point. I'm in Bob's home directory, and I didn't specify another directory to list, so when I typed in ls, it just gave me the contents of Bob's home directory. If I wanted to, I could do an ls of the Etsy directory, and it's showing me the contents of Etsy, even though I'm still currently sitting in Bob's directory. See how that goes? Okay, how about switches? Switches, in most cases, not all cases, but most cases, are preceded with a dash and can be made up of either a single letter or several letters. And I know that's vague. Linux commands are very, very inconsistent in the way they're structured. Reason, because they were written over a long period of time by a great many different people, and there's really no consistency in how the commands are organized or how the way they are structured. What you have to do really is learn each individual command. But fortunately, there is a built-in help system we're going to look at here in a second. Now, one of the switches for the ls command is the L switch, ls-l. Right? That gives me a long listing. And if I just run this without giving it an argument or a directory to list, it'll show me the contents, again, of Bob's home directory, the one we're currently in. Only this time in long format. Long format, it gives me things like permissions, ownership information, date timestamps, that kind of thing. Don't worry about this. We'll cover permissions issues and all that later on. Another switch is the -a switch. And what that means is list everything. See these other files that showed up here, the ones with the dots in front of them? These are hidden files. And they're under bash, any file or directory that starts with a dot is a hidden directory. And it won't show up under a regular listing. But it will show up under the -a listing. And I can even stack my commands. So I can do an ls-al. And that shows me all the hidden files and folders in addition to the normal ones in long format. And it goes on and on and on. There are a whole boatload of switches for most commands. Great, how do we find it? There is a built-in help system, and actually there's a couple of built-in help systems. One is called the info system. And what it means is you simply type in the command info, and then the command you want information on. And it goes through and it tells you what the command actually does, right? It gives you some details about it. And if you keep scrolling down, here it goes down into the switches. So for example, -a can also be represented as --all. Small case a versus uppercase A. Remember, Linux is case sensitive. So these two are two different switches altogether. And here are all the switches that are part of the ls command. Q is simply to quit out of that. Another help system are called the man pages, and it works the same way. You type in man, that stands for manual, as in owner's manual, ls, and it's the same idea. It's a little more succinct, but it gives you what the command is, tells you what it does, the command, the option, otherwise known as switches, the file, in other words, the argument, what are you using it against, and again, it goes through and lists all the available switches to us. And these two help systems are really what you use to figure out how to make commands do what you want them to do. Even experienced admins rarely know all the commands, but they do know where to find it. And they also understand a core set of commands. I encourage you, explore around. Explore the GNOME desktop, explore the bash command terminal. Don't worry, you can't break anything. Push comes to shove and you completely torch up your machine, we just reinstall from back into the VM again. Not a big deal. Explore around, see what's out there, and I will see you next lecture.